You see the headlines, you hear the stories, and sometimes something just feels fundamentally wrong. Think back to like a crisis moment, maybe after a hurricane, and suddenly the price of basic stuff like ice and water just skyrockets. I remember the Florida Attorney General back then called it an astounding level of greed. There was that immediate gut feeling of injustice.
And it's not just during natural disasters, right? Remember the outrage during the financial crisis when AIG, after getting those massive taxpayer bailouts, turned around and handed out lavish
Oh,
bonuses.
yeah.
The CEO actually defended them, said they needed the payouts to attract the best and brightest talent to help the company recover, which, supposedly would benefit the taxpayers who basically own the company then. But for so many people, it just felt like rewarding the very folks who helped cause the crisis using public money.
Totally. And those feel like really different situations, don't they? One's like private individuals charging high prices. The other's about corporate behavior funded by the government. But you're right, there's definitely a common thread there, this strong sense that something is unjust. And it immediately makes you ask, well, what exactly is justice? How do we even figure out the right thing to do?
That question, that's exactly what drives the sources we've been digging into. What they show is that when we debate things like price gouging or, corporate bailouts, we're often, maybe without even realizing it, tapping into these deep disagreements rooted in three fundamental ideas about what a just society really looks like.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
Yeah.
What are these three big ideas and how are we going to, navigate them here?
Well, our mission in this deep dive is basically to use the source material as our map. We'll explore these three distinct ways of thinking about justice: maximizing welfare, respecting freedom, and promoting virtue. We'll look at how these ideas play out in all sorts of real-world dilemmas and try to see the deep arguments, the ones lying beneath the surface of all our public debates. It's a kind of a shortcut to understanding the core principles at stake.
Perfect. So let's circle back to that Hurricane Charlie price gouging example you mentioned. How did those three ideas apply right there?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, actually. The arguments against price gouging, the kind of outrage the Attorney General expressed, they often appeal to this idea of virtue. Greed is seen as a vice, right? Something especially bad in a time of shared hardship. A good society, this view suggests, is one where people pull together, they don't exploit vulnerability. So price gouging laws, they're meant to restrain that kind of brazen greed and signal society's disapproval. They affirm civic virtue.
So it's like the law isn't just about the money, it's about what kind of community we actually want to be.
Exactly. It's making a statement about our shared values. But then, on the other hand, arguments for price gouging, they typically appeal to freedom. The core idea there is that buyers and sellers should just be free to make whatever deals they choose in the market voluntarily.
Right.
So interfering with that is seen as interfering with individual liberty. If someone's willing to pay a high price for ice and someone else is willing to sell it, who is the government to step in and say no?
Right. The whole idea of property rights and free exchange. That makes sense.
Precisely. And then there's a third argument, one you often hear from economists, which appeals to welfare. This view argues that letting prices rise in a crisis, yeah, it's painful short term, but it actually promotes overall welfare in the long run. Well, the high prices create a really strong incentive for suppliers to rush goods into the affected area. It directs resources efficiently to where they're most needed. So ultimately, it gets essential supplies to more people faster than, say, rationing or keeping prices artificially low would.
So the high price, even if it feels intuitively wrong, is actually seen as serving the greater good because it increases supply.
Exactly. It's seen as the most efficient way to maximize the availability of goods and therefore maximize overall welfare. So just in that one example, you see the tension, right, between these three ways of looking at justice: virtue, freedom, and welfare.
Wow. It's fascinating how something as simple as the price of ice can reveal these really deep philosophical disagreements. Okay, let's dive into that first one you mentioned. Maximizing welfare. That's utilitarianism, right?
Utilitarianism, yeah. Drawing on thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, it basically argues that the moral thing to do, the just policy, is always the one that maximizes overall happiness, or as they call it, utility. The guiding principle is just the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
Okay, yeah, the classic add up the good, subtract the bad, go with the biggest number kind of thinking. How do the sources illustrate this?
They use a really classic thought experiment to really probe our intuitions about this. It's the trolley problem.
Oh, the trolley problem. Yeah, I know this one. Runaway trolley, heading towards 5 people tied to the track.
Right. So scenario one, you're the driver. You can steer the trolley onto a different track, but there's one worker on that track. Turn, and you kill the one, but save the 5. Most people, when you ask them, say, yeah, turn the trolley, sacrifice 1 life to save 5. That fits right in with utilitarian logic. 5 lives saved is better than 1.
Makes sense, purely based on the numbers, yeah.
But then, scenario 2. Now you're not the driver, you're just an onlooker standing on a bridge over the track. Trolley's still heading for the 5. Next to you, there's a very heavy man. You realize if you push him off the bridge, his body will stop the trolley. He'll die, but the 5 will be saved. Now what do you do?
Oh.
Most people say don't push the man.
And that's the puzzle, isn't it? The outcome is identical. 1 life sacrificed to save 5, but it feels completely different. Turning the trolley seems okay, but pushing the man feels just wrong. Why is that?
That's the core question the trolley problem throws up. The sources explore variations too, like what if you could pull a lever to open a trap door and drop the man? Does that make it different? It really forces us to confront what principles we're actually using when we make these moral judgments. Is it just about the consequences, like utilitarianism says? Or are there other things going on, like the difference between actively killing someone versus diverting a pre-existing threat? The source even connects this to really tough military decisions, like the one Marcus Luttrell faced in Afghanistan with the unarmed goat herds. Calculating lives lost versus lives saved becomes terrifyingly real there.
Wow, yeah, that really brings it down to earth in a powerful way. But the source material points out some pretty serious challenges to this whole utilitarian approach, doesn't it?
It does. It raises 2 major objections, really. The first one is that utilitarianism can basically run roughshod over individual rights. Because it only cares about the total sum of happiness, it doesn't necessarily treat individuals as, ends in themselves with inherent worth. Their value is just kind of their preferences getting added to the big total. Which means, in principle, you could violate the rights of one person if it benefits a large number of others.
Like the debate over torture, which the source brings up.
Yeah.
It links it to arguments made by people like former Vice President Cheney. If torturing one suspected terrorist could prevent a massive attack and save thousands of lives, a pure utilitarian calculation might actually justify it.
Exactly. If the suffering of the one is outweighed by preventing the suffering of thousands, the math seems to work out for the utilitarian. The sources also use that fictional story, the ones who walked away from Omelas. The beautiful city whose perfect happiness depends entirely on the perpetual awful misery of one child locked away in a basement. The question is, could the happiness of the whole city ever justify violating that one child's fundamental rights so drastically? Utilitarianism really struggles with that.
That's a chilling example,
Yes,
definitely.
yeah.
What's the second big objection?
The second objection is about this idea of a common currency of value. Utilitarianism tries to sort of aggregate all preferences and values, pleasures, pains, desires, everything onto a single scale, treating them as if they're directly comparable. But the sources argue that some things just resist being measured and compared like that.
I mean, like trying to put a dollar value on absolutely everything?
Precisely. The source gives some really stark examples of cost-benefit analyses that try to do exactly that. There's that infamous Philip Morris study in the Czech Republic. They calculated that the government actually saved money from smoking-related deaths.
Saved money? How?
Well, after factoring in healthcare savings, from people dying earlier and pension reductions and stuff like that, they figured the government netted $1,227 per death.
Wow. That's just disturbing. You hear that and you feel that same sense of wrongness we talked about right at the start.
Yeah, it provoked widespread outrage. Philip Morris had to apologize, admitting it showed a complete and unacceptable disregard of basic human values, unquote. Another really powerful example is the Ford Pinto case from the 70s. Internal Ford documents came out showing this cost-benefit analysis they did. They literally weighed the cost of fixing the gas tanks. It was about $11 per car against the estimated monetary value they put on human lives lost, $200,000 per fatality, and injuries, $67,000. And the math, according to Ford's analysis, suggested it was cheaper not to install the $11 safety part.
And again, the public outcry wasn't just about the calculation being flawed. It was about the very idea that you could put a price tag on a human life and decide it wasn't worth an $11 part.
Exactly. It really highlights the difficulty and often the sort of moral repugnance we feel when fundamental human values get reduced to just a single quantitative scale, like money or utility. The source also mentions some older studies, like one by the psychologist Edward Thorndike. He tried to quantify people's preferences for really disparate things, like how much money would it take for you to eat a live earthworm versus, how disagreeable is life on a farm in Kansas. Even back then, respondents apparently found some things immeasurably repugnant, suggesting they just couldn't be neatly compared on a single scale.
Or that story about St. Anne's College at Oxford debating rules about overnight guests. When they tried to translate the language of virtue, someone said overnight guests were degrading the college's moral fiber or something into the language of utility, like, let's just charge guests 50 pence a night. The moral point was completely lost. It just sounded absurd.
Yeah, these examples together really challenge that core utilitarian idea that all our values can be captured and accurately compared on one single scale.
So, utilitarianism, while it's aiming for the greatest good for the most people, seems to run into some serious trouble when it comes to protecting individual rights and valuing things that seem, well, priceless.
It certainly does. And John Stuart Mill, actually, he recognized some of these problems and tried to offer a more refined version of utilitarianism. He argued that respecting individual liberty, even if it causes some short-term unhappiness, would actually maximize utility in the long run. He also tried to distinguish between higher and lower pleasures, arguing some kinds of happiness are just qualitatively better, more valuable than others. Though his test for figuring out which pleasures are higher, basically, asking experienced people what they prefer, still kind of relies on aggregation, just a more complex kind.
Okay, that makes sense, trying to build some nuance into the system.
Yeah.
All right, so that's maximizing welfare. Let's shift gears. What's the second big idea about justice?
Okay, the second one is all about respecting freedom. This is where libertarianism comes in. The core principle here is that a just society is one that prioritizes individual liberty and freedom of choice above pretty much everything else. And it's grounded in this really powerful idea of self-ownership.
Self-ownership. Okay, so the basic belief that I own myself, my body, my labor, and therefore the fruits of my labor.
Exactly. And starting from that idea, thinkers like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman argue for what they call a minimal state.
A minimal state. What does that look like?
Well, it's one that rejects paternalism. So no laws designed to protect you from yourself, like mandatory seatbelt laws or motorcycle helmet laws. It rejects morals legislation laws that try to enforce a particular moral code, like banning gambling or prostitution if it's between consenting adults. And crucially, it strongly rejects any redistribution of income or wealth through taxes.
Anything that forces you to act against your will or takes your legitimately earned money to give to someone else is seen as a violation of your fundamental freedom and that core idea of self-ownership.
Precisely. Things like mandatory Social Security, laws forcing you to save for retirement, even occupational licensing requirements. Friedman famously argued against state licensing for doctors, saying anyone should be free to offer medical services as long as they're upfront about their qualifications. All these are seen as violations of liberty because they interfere with the free choices made by individuals who own themselves.
Okay, how do they illustrate that point about redistribution being unjust? That seems like a big one.
Yeah, it is. The source uses Robert Nozick's really famous thought experiment involving originally Wilt Chamberlain, but you could update it to Michael Jordan. Imagine, Nozick says, we start with whatever distribution of wealth you personally consider to be perfectly just. Let's say, for argument's sake, everyone has exactly the same amount of money.
Okay, fair starting point, equality.
Now, millions of people freely choose to pay, say, $5 each to watch Michael Jordan play basketball. They willingly put their money into a special box with Jordan's name on it. By the end of the season, Jordan has collected, let's say, $31 million from these voluntary payments. The overall distribution of wealth is now highly unequal compared to where we started.
Right, but it came about purely from voluntary transactions.
Yeah.
Nobody forced those fans to pay Jordan. They chose to give him their money because they wanted to see him play.
That's exactly Nozick's point. He argues that this resulting unequal distribution is perfectly just because it arose entirely from free choices and voluntary exchanges. No coercion involved. The fans who paid chose to do so. Those who didn't want to pay Jordan are no worse off than they were before they still have their $5.
And so, taxing that $31 million, even to help the poor or fund public services, is seen as unjust by libertarians.
Yes. And Nozick gives a really powerful reason why. He argues that taxing Jordan's income is essentially the same as forcing him to work for the state for a certain number of hours. If the government can claim, say, 30% of his earnings, it's claiming a property right in 30% of his labor, which means it's effectively claiming a property right in him. It makes the state, Nozick says, a kind of part owner of its citizens. And that, he argues, is akin to forced labor.
Ah, okay. That's the direct line they draw. Taxation for redistribution violates self-ownership because it's like claiming ownership over someone else's time and labor.
Right. Now, the source material doesn't just present this view, it also pushes back, raising some important objections to the libertarian stance.
Okay, so what are the potential weaknesses or the counter-arguments here?
Well, one common objection is that Jordan, as a citizen living in a democracy, implicitly consents to the tax laws. He benefits from living in the society, he can vote, he participates.
Right, he's part of the system that makes the rules, so he has to abide by them.
The libertarian reply to that is, well, is that really enough to count as consent? What if he voted against the tax law? The government is still going to make him pay. Does simply living somewhere, or even casting a vote, mean you automatically consent in advance to any law the majority might pass, even one that feels like confiscating your property? They argue that genuine consent requires something more active and specific than just residing in a country.
Okay, that's a fair point about the nature of consent. What's another challenge to the libertarian idea, especially linked to that Jordan example?
A really significant objection is that Jordan is just plain lucky. He's incredibly fortunate to have been born with amazing athletic gifts. He's also lucky to live in a society that happens to value basketball so highly that people are willing to pay millions to watch him play.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't his doing that he won the genetic lottery or that basketball is popular right now. He didn't create those conditions himself.
Exactly. So the argument goes, does he really deserve all the rewards that flow from those lucky circumstances? But the libertarian reply is sharp. If he doesn't own the benefits derived from his talents and efforts, then who does? If Jordan isn't entitled to the fruits of exercising his abilities, who is? Does the community somehow have a collective claim on his talents or the wealth they generate? This line of questioning directly challenges that fundamental libertarian premise of self-ownership.
Right. It forces you to confront the alternative. If you don't own your talents and what comes from them, who does? The state, the community.
And the sources push this even further, exploring the potentially, well, unsettling implications if you take the principle of self-ownership to its absolute logical extreme. If I truly own myself, my body, my labor completely, then shouldn't I be free to sell my body parts? Like the debate over legalizing the sale of kidneys comes up. While most people advocating for kidney markets focus on the life-saving potential, the pure self-ownership argument suggests you should be free to sell a kidney simply because it's yours to dispose of as you wish, whether you need the money, whether it saves a life or not.
That definitely pushes the boundaries. And the sources even mention conceptually how this idea, if taken to its absolute limit, could theoretically justify things like consensual cannibalism, right? As extreme examples where the idea of absolute bodily autonomy runs into strong moral objections for most people.
Exactly. They serve as limit cases to test the principle. So while self-ownership is a really appealing idea, it grounds our sense of individual rights and resonates with our desire for freedom. Following it all the way down the line can lead to conclusions that many, maybe most people find morally very difficult to accept.
Yeah. It starts with a simple, powerful idea, but those edge cases really make you pause and think. Okay, so we've covered maximizing welfare and respecting freedom. What's the third major way of thinking about justice?
The third lens, which is strongly associated with the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, is all about promoting virtue. For Aristotle, figuring out justice requires thinking about two key things. First, justice is teleological.
Teleological. What does that mean?
It means you have to figure out the purpose, the end goal, the telos, that's the Greek word of the social practice or the institution you're dealing with. And second, justice is honorific. This means that figuring out rights and what's fair involves reasoning about which virtues or excellences that particular practice or institution should honor and reward.
Okay, so you need to know the purpose, the telos, and what virtues it's supposed to honor. How did Aristotle explain this?
His classic example is about distributing flutes. Imagine you have a limited number of really high-quality flutes to give out. Who should get them? Not necessarily the richest person, Aristotle says. Not the best-looking person. Not the person from the noblest family. The best flutes should go to the best flute players.
Why? Because that's what flutes are for, to be played well.
Exactly. The purpose, the telos, of a flute is to produce beautiful music, which requires being played well. To distribute the best instruments to people who can't play them well, or at all, would be unjust because it fails to respect the purpose of the flute itself. Justice, in this Aristotelian view, is about matching persons to roles, or goods to pursers, in a way that fits the purpose of the thing being distributed and honors the relevant excellences or virtues.
That's a really different way of thinking. It's not just about outcomes like welfare or about choice like freedom, but about fulfilling the inherent purpose of something. How does the source apply this kind of thinking to modern issues?
A really good example discussed is the debate over who should be eligible for the Purple Heart Medal in the U.S. military. The medal traditionally honors sacrifice, specifically being wounded or killed in combat action. A debate arose a while back. Should soldiers suffering from severe psychological injuries, like PTSD resulting from combat, also be eligible?
Right, I remember that controversy. There's quite a bit of pushback from some veterans groups, wasn't there?
Yes. The source mentions a spokesman for the Military Order of the Purple Heart explicitly opposing it. He argued that the criterion should remain shedding blood, and that including psychological injuries would somehow debase the honor. The source argues that this isn't just a medical classification issue, it's fundamentally a debate about the meaning and purpose of the medal. What specific kind of sacrifice is the Purple Heart meant to recognize and honor? The debate reflects, as the source puts it, rival conceptions of moral character and military valor.
Ah, so it's a debate about the telos of the Purple Heart itself.
Yeah.
What virtues, what kind of sacrifice is it meant to honor?
Precisely. And you see this same kind of teleological reasoning pop up in the affirmative action debate regarding university admissions. The core question becomes, what is the purpose, the telos, of a university? Is its sole purpose scholarly excellence, meaning academic merit, grades, test scores should be the only relevant criterion for admission? Or does a university also have broader civic purposes, like training future leaders for a diverse society, promoting social mobility, or contributing to knowledge that serves the community? If those are also part of its purpose, then factors beyond pure academic metrics like diversity might become relevant and just criteria.
So figuring out what's fair or just in admissions depends crucially on what we agree the university is actually for.
Exactly. The source discusses arguments, like Ronald Dworkin's, suggesting that using race as one factor among many to achieve diversity is fundamentally different from old-style segregation. Why? Because it's not based on a belief in racial inferiority, but rather on the idea that diversity is a socially useful trait that helps the university achieve its educational and civic purposes. But then critics, the source points out, raise a serious concern. Does this diversity rationale end up treating individuals merely as instruments, using their race or background as instruments of a wider social purpose, rather than valuing them as individuals?
Like those incredibly blunt, hypothetical rejection and acceptance letters the source includes. One basically saying, sorry, you're qualified, but we don't need your type right now. And the other saying, congrats, you happen to have the traits society finds useful at the moment, so we're going to admit you to benefit others.
Yeah, those examples really cut to the heart of the worry whether this approach respects individuals as ends in themselves or just sees them as bundles of useful characteristics to be deployed for some larger social goal. This Aristotelian approach forces us to ask these deeper questions, not just what's the outcome or was there consent, but what is the essential purpose of this activity or institution, and what excellences or virtues does it aim to cultivate and honor?
And Aristotle himself had a very strong view about the purpose of politics, didn't he? It wasn't just about setting rules for the economy or protecting rights.
No, not at all. Unlike many modern views that see politics primarily as a neutral framework for individuals to pursue their own interests, Aristotle saw the purpose, the telos, of the political community. He called it as something much deeper and more ambitious. It was about forming good citizens and cultivating good character.
Wow. So for him, politics isn't supposed to be neutral on moral questions. It's actively involved in shaping who we are, morally speaking.
Absolutely. He believed that human beings only fully realize their distinctive nature, our capacity for reason, language, and virtue, by participating in the life of a political community. By deliberating with fellow citizens about justice and injustice, about the common good, we are, in his famous phrase, political animals, meant to live and flourish in a polis.
And how did he think we actually learn to be virtuous? Is it like learning math rules from a book?
Not exactly. He thought moral virtue isn't primarily learned just by grasping principles, but by doing. By practicing virtuous actions until they become habit, it's more like learning a craft or a skill, like learning to cook or play a musical instrument. You get better through practice, by doing the right thing repeatedly. Moral education, for Aristotle, is less about memorizing rules and more about developing good habits and practical wisdom, the ability to discern the right way to act in particular complex situations, like an experienced ship captain navigating a storm.
That practical habit-forming aspect is really interesting. The source uses the Casey Martin golf cart case as a kind of modern illustration of this type of debate about the purpose, the telos, of a practice.
Yes, exactly. Casey Monton, you might remember, was a professional golfer with a circulatory disorder in his leg that made walking the course extremely painful and difficult. He requested permission from the PGA Tour to use a golf cart during competitions, arguing it was a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The PGA Tour refused, arguing that walking the course was an essential, fundamental part of the game of professional golf. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Martin argued that walking wasn't truly essential to the nature of golf. The core skill was shot making.
And Justice Scalia wrote a dissent, right?
Mm.
Arguing something like, game rules are just arbitrary, they only exist for amusement, so judges have no business trying to figure out what's essential to a game's nature.
Right. Scalia basically said, look, games are just entertainment, their rules are artificial constructs, they don't have some deep object beyond amusement. So the courts shouldn't get into the business of deciding which arbitrary rule is essential. But the source argues that Scalia's view actually disparages sports. It suggests that most serious fans and players do believe that the rules of a game aren't just arbitrary. They're designed precisely to call forth and celebrate specific skills, talents, and virtues, things like athleticism, strategy, concentration, grace under pressure that we admire. So debating whether walking is essential to golf is actually debating the point, the telos of competitive golf. What skills is it meant to test? What excellences does it honor? It's a real-world example of how we implicitly engage in this kind of Aristotelian reasoning about purpose and honor, even when talking about sports.
Okay, so we've looked at justice through these three really powerful and often conflicting lenses: maximizing welfare or utility, respecting freedom based on self-ownership, and promoting virtue by considering purpose and honor.
Yeah, they definitely highlight different moral priorities and can lead to very different conclusions about what the right thing to do is. And the sources then introduce another layer of complexity by challenging a really common modern assumption, one that's especially prevalent when we think in terms of freedom and maybe even welfare. The idea that justice and our moral obligations fundamentally stem from consent or free choice.
You mean the idea that our only real obligations are the ones we've explicitly agreed to, the ones we've voluntarily taken on?
Exactly that idea. The sources introduce the counter-argument that we might actually have significant moral obligations, obligations of solidarity or membership that we haven't chosen, obligations that arise simply from the communities and histories we're a part of. This view is often tied to what's called a narrative conception of personhood, the idea that my identity isn't just something I invent for myself from scratch, but it's deeply bound up with the stories, traditions, and communities that shape who I am.
So I'm not just this isolated, atomistic individual making choices in a vacuum, but I'm situated, I'm embedded in a larger story, a history, a community.
Precisely. And if that's a more accurate picture of who we are, then it might mean we inherit certain obligations or bear certain responsibilities simply by virtue of belonging to that community or inheriting that history obligations we didn't personally sign up for. The sources give several really compelling examples of this kind of obligation. One major one is the whole debate around public apologies and reparations for large-scale historic injustices.
Right, like post-war Germany making reparations to Israel and Holocaust survivors, or the ongoing difficult debate in the United States about whether there should be reparations for slavery and its legacy.
Exactly. Now, arguments against things like reparations often rely heavily on that principle of moral individualism we discussed with libertarianism. I never owned a slave, as the late Congressman Henry Hyde famously put it, or the point that no one alive today personally committed those historical wrongs. The logic is, I'm only responsible for my own choices and actions.
But the counter-argument, coming from this narrative or solidarity perspective, is that if my identity as, say, an American is inescapably tied to the nation's history, including its history of slavery and discrimination, then I might bear some form of collective responsibility to address the ongoing consequences of that past, even though I wasn't personally involved in the original injustice.
Or consider the deeply personal, often agonizing examples of conflicting loyalties the sources bring up. There's the case of the Bulger brothers in Boston. William Bulger was a powerful state politician, while his brother, Whitey, was a notorious fugitive gangster. William Bulger faced intense criticism for refusing to fully cooperate with authorities trying to capture his brother, citing family loyalty. The prosecutor's sharp question during a hearing, "What do you feel you owe in terms of loyalty? Is it more loyalty to your brother than to the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts?" perfectly captures that clash between unchosen family bonds and chosen civic obligations.
And that incredibly painful story of the Kaczynski brothers. David Kaczynski making the heart-wrenching decision to turn in his own brother Ted, the Unabomber, based on suspicions from Ted's writings. He felt an obligation to prevent further harm, despite the immense loyalty and love he felt for his brother. Ted later called David a Judas Iscariot. These stories really highlight the intense power of these unchosen ties and the terrible dilemmas that arise when they conflict.
They really do. And the sources bring the same idea of unchosen obligations into the public realm, into questions of patriotism and civic duty. Do we, as citizens of a particular country, have special obligations to our fellow citizens that go beyond the general duties we owe to all human beings?
It certainly seems like we often act as if we do.
We definitely do. Think about the debate over military service, the draft versus the all-volunteer army. The source points out that if the old Civil War system, where wealthy men could pay poorer substitutes to fight in their place, felt deeply unfair and unjust, isn't today's all-volunteer army somewhat similar in principle? Those who don't want to serve, or whose children don't serve, are effectively hiring others to do the fighting, often drawing disproportionately from lower-income communities and minority groups who are more attracted by the enlistment bonuses and economic opportunities, as Congressman Charles Rangel often argued.
And the source poses a really provocative question based on that. If the free market is the right way to raise an army, why should we limit the hiring pool to only American citizens? Why not hire soldiers from poorer countries where the pay would be even more attractive? It could potentially save taxpayer money and provide opportunities.
Right. The source suggests that the main reason we don't seriously consider that, the main reason we instinctively feel military service should be performed by citizens, is because we implicitly believe that serving one's country is, or should be, a civic obligation, an expression of shared citizenship and mutual duty. And that requires believing in special obligations we owe to our own community, our own people. You see the same logic, or at least assumption, underlying things like Buy American provisions, sometimes included in economic stimulus packages. Why should American taxpayers be more concerned with creating jobs specifically for Americans than for workers overseas, especially if the overseas goods are cheaper?
Again, it seems to point back to this idea that we feel, or society expects us to feel, a special connection and obligation to our fellow citizens, simply because they are our fellow citizens, part of our national community.
Which is actually quite hard to justify philosophically if you only accept obligations that arise from universal duties, like don't murder anyone, or from explicit consent, like signing a contract. Immigration debates also frequently touch on this implicitly. Why do most countries restrict immigration, even if allowing more people in, especially from impoverished nations, might significantly improve their lives and potentially even benefit the host country's economy in the long run? A strong argument for restriction often relies implicitly or explicitly on the idea that the government has a primary, special obligation to protect the jobs, wages, culture, or social services available to its own current citizens.
So this whole line of thinking about solidarity and membership really pushes back hard against that common picture of the self as completely independent, unbound, free from any moral ties we haven't personally chosen for ourselves.
Exactly. It contrasts that highly individualist conception of the self, where all obligations must derive from consent, with what the source calls the narrative or situated self, a self whose identity is partly constituted by its membership in communities and its place in their ongoing stories, and who therefore inherits certain loyalties and obligations. The source suggests that a lot of the modern resistance to acknowledging these kinds of obligations of solidarity comes from a deep, often unexamined commitment to that individualist vision of freedom as being fundamentally unencumbered.
And this loops right back around to the justice debate, doesn't it? If this narrative, community-bound view of the self is actually more accurate, or at least part of the picture, what does that imply for how we should think about justice and politics?
Well, it implies, perhaps, that Aristotle was really onto something important. If understanding who I am requires understanding my place within the communities I belong to and their traditions, maybe achieving a just society requires us to engage in public deliberation about the common good, about the good life for our community. And this directly challenges a very powerful ideal in modern liberal political thought.
Yeah.
The aspiration to neutrality.
Neutrality. You mean the idea that the government should try to stay neutral on controversial moral and religious questions?
Exactly that. The ideal, famously articulated by figures like John F. Kennedy in his 1960 speech about his Catholicism, is that the state should provide a neutral framework of rights and laws. Within that framework, individuals should be completely free to choose and pursue their own conception of the good life based on their own values. This idea has been influential across the political spectrum. You see Republicans invoking it to argue for free markets and lower taxes. Government shouldn't interfere with individual economic choices, and Democrats invoking it to argue on social and cultural issues. Like abortion rights, LGBTQ+ rights, the state shouldn't impose a particular moral code.
Right. The basic idea is the government shouldn't be in the business of endorsing or promoting any particular way of life over others.
That's the theory. But the sources argue pretty strongly that this aspiration to neutrality, while appealing, is often impossible to achieve in practice, and maybe isn't even desirable in some cases. Why? Because many of the most pressing debates we have about justice and rights today seem to require us, unavoidably, to take a stand on precisely those controversial moral or even religious questions about the nature of the good life.
Okay, where does this ideal of neutrality tend to break down? What are the examples?
Well, abortion and embryonic stem cell research are prime examples the source uses. It argues that you simply can't resolve the fundamental legal questions about their permissibility without implicitly or explicitly taking a stand on the underlying moral status of the fetus or the embryo. When does personhood begin? What moral weight does potential life carry? The argument for allowing stem cell research, for instance, necessarily presupposes that the early stage embryo is not yet a human being with the full moral status and rights of a person. That stance itself is not neutral, it's a substantive moral judgment.
Right. It requires making a moral or metaphysical claim about when life with rights begins. You can't avoid it.
Exactly. Same-sex marriage is another major example discussed. Can a government or a court decide whether the state should legally recognize same-sex unions without engaging with competing moral and religious views about the purpose, the telos of marriage itself, and the moral status of homosexuality? The source acknowledges that some proponents tried to argue for same-sex marriage purely on neutral liberal grounds like non-discrimination, equal protection, or freedom of choice between consenting adults.
But the source argues that even those arguments aren't truly neutral, because they implicitly require adopting a certain view of what marriage is for. If marriage is just a private arrangement based solely on choice and consent, why limit it to only two people? Why not recognize polygamous unions or temporary contracts?
The source even mentions Michael Kinsley's provocative suggestion back then. If we really want neutrality, maybe the state should get out of the marriage business altogether, abolish state-sanctioned marriage, and just offer neutral civil unions to any couple or group that wants legal recognition. Though very few people actually supported that radical solution. And importantly, the source highlights how Chief Justice Margaret Marshall's opinion in the landmark Massachusetts case legalizing same-sex marriage, Goodridge, actually went beyond pure neutrality. She didn't just argue based on non-discrimination. She explicitly affirmed the moral worth and dignity of same-sex relationships and offered a positive vision of marriage's public purpose as a voluntary union for the mutual support and commitment of spouses, embodying ideals like mutuality, companionship, intimacy, fidelity, and family. She noted that in conferring the benefits of marriage, the state acts as an approving partner, highlighting that marriage, even when framed in terms of liberty, retains an honorific aspect. It signifies social approval and endorsement of certain kinds of relationships and commitments. This, the source argues, shows the state isn't, and perhaps cannot be, truly neutral about the meaning and purpose of marriage.
Wow. Okay. So the big takeaway here seems to be that justice isn't always just about calculating welfare or ensuring maximum freedom of choice within a neutral framework. It often forces us, whether we like it or not, to engage publicly and politically with these deeper competing ideas about the good life and the fundamental purposes of our shared institutions and practices.
That's really the synthesis that emerges from the sources. The aspiration to find neutral principles of justice that don't rely on any particular conception of the good is understandable, especially given the diversity of modern societies. But it's often unsuccessful because the justice questions themselves are intrinsically moral. And maybe it's even undesirable because it prevents us from having the necessary, albeit difficult, public conversations about what really matters most to us as a community.
This seems to point towards that idea of a politics of moral engagement that the source mentions towards the end.
Yes, exactly. The suggestion that perhaps a truly just society, or at least a society striving for justice, requires a more robust public life where we don't shy away from debating these competing conceptions of virtue and the common good, where we actively engage with our moral disagreements in the public square.
But that immediately raises the big worry, doesn't it? If we start putting controversial moral and religious arguments directly into politics, won't that just lead to more division, intolerance, maybe even coercion? How do we have those debates in a pluralistic society without things falling apart or one group trying to impose its values on everyone else?
That's the crucial question, and it's a very real danger the sources absolutely acknowledge. They don't offer any simple formula, of course. But one suggestion offered is that perhaps part of the answer lies in shifting the focus. Instead of just arguing abstractly about values, maybe we need to pay more attention to the civic consequences of things like vast economic inequality. Maybe we need to invest more deliberately in the civic infrastructure, things like good public schools accessible to all, public transportation systems, parks, libraries, community centers, places, and institutions that draw people together from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different viewpoints. The idea is to foster a stronger sense of shared citizenship and common experience, which might make those difficult moral conversations more possible, more respectful. It's about framing issues like distributive justice, not just as how we slice the economic pie, but as essential for cultivating the solidarity and mutual respect needed for a healthy, democratic public life.
So connecting those questions about wealth, resources, and opportunity back to the kind of common life, the kind of citizens we want to be.
Exactly. And it resonates with that famous quote from Robert F. Kennedy that the source mentions about how the gross national product measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. It's a reminder that a just and good society ultimately requires us to deliberate about and value things that go beyond purely economic metrics or individual preferences.
Wow. This deep dive has taken us on a really significant journey. We started with gut feelings about price gouging and AIG bonuses, and we've traveled through these classic thought experiments like the trolley problem, looked at real-world legal battles over things like Purple Hearts and golf carts, and examined justice through these big lenses of welfare, freedom, and virtue. And importantly, it's challenged some of our maybe unexamined modern assumptions about consent being the only source of obligation, about the possibility and desirability of government neutrality, and even about the nature of the self. Are we just unbound individuals, or are we deeply shaped by our communities and histories?
Yeah, I think the core takeaway is that figuring out the right thing to do, achieving a just society, it's rarely simple. It often involves really wrestling with these fundamental, sometimes conflicting ideas about what constitutes a good life, what we owe to one another as individuals and as members of communities, and what the true purposes are of our most important shared institutions.
So, as you, our listener, go about your day, maybe keep an ear out for debates and arguments that touch on these themes. When you hear people arguing about a policy or a controversy, try to identify which of these lenses, welfare, freedom, virtue, they might be implicitly using. Or notice if they're making assumptions about consent or neutrality or community obligations that you might now question a bit more. And maybe here's a final thought, something for you to continue mulling over. If achieving justice really does require us to debate competing ideas about the good life, how can we actually have these potentially difficult, morally charged conversations in our diverse societies in a way that is genuinely respectful of different viewpoints, but also constructive? How can we strengthen our civic bonds through these conversations, rather than just deepening the fractures? And related to that, how do we personally navigate those powerful obligations we often feel towards our families, our communities, our fellow citizens, those unchosen ties of loyalty and solidarity, in a world that also places such a high and often valid premium on individual freedom and personal choice? There are no easy answers, but hopefully this dive gives you some new tools to think about them.